Hello to you, I do hope you're well, and a very warm welcome to this A-level religious ethics revision session on, of all topics imaginable, sex ethics. I mean, why not? So I thought, you know what, we'll bring out the pink, to make the boys wink, and we will talk sex ethics, because do you know what, it's controversial, it's a great topic to get your teeth into. Now, for the OCR religious ethics exam at least, when it comes to sex ethics, we're talking about premarital and extramarital sex and homosexuality. Just you wait till you hear my opinions on premarital sex, obviously. And then the theories. It's all about applying the theories of natural law, situation ethics, Kantian ethics and utilitarianism. And of course we've got two religious theories in there, so we're going to be asking, well, is it right to be adding religious perspectives, to be saying it's religion that can have a say over what we're involved in sexually, or is it a private matter? And John Stuart Mill is here to save the day with his thoughts on liberty, on the principle of liberty and the non-harm principle, which played a key role in the decriminalisation of homosexuality in the UK. So first of all, we're going to start with premarital sex, okay, and extramarital sex, having an affair. And religion has traditionally been the key influence on all teaching and thought on this area. The idea of marriage as a lifelong union, the idea, remember, for sex ethics, in religious ethics, we're talking all the time, where we can, about the Bible. So the idea, what God has joined together, may man not separate. The two become one flesh. These key Christian teachings, this idea of marriage as this lifelong union with the aim of having children, of producing a new family, a covenant. God is involved in the marriage. He's the third individual in the marriage, very much involved in it. So you've got the man, the woman and God together, the children, as part of the faith church community. Now, there's lots of issues around premarital sex and extramarital sex, of course, that therefore arise from this. Cohabitation is the first one. So many people now live together before getting married, or never get married, they just live together, maybe even have children, raise children, live together like that, especially in the UK. And William and Kate, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, did this before they got married. They lived together. It's like a trial period, you know. You're marrying this person for life, hopefully. You're going to be stuck with them for the rest of your days. Surely a trial period just to test it out is the right thing to do. Situation ethics, because we're applying straight away, could say, you know, it's a loving thing. If it's what makes them happy to live together and they don't necessarily need the formality of marriage, why not do it? Love is central. If the love is there, then go for it. We've also got the issue of contraception. The church has traditionally been very against the use of any contraception, because every sexual act, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, remember, our key church doctor, throwing it back to Summa Theologica, he is very clear about it being open to the transmission of life. Without getting too graphic on you, he wrote, you know, an extensive paragraph about how whenever there is the emission of semen, then there has to be the chance of life being created. So in other words, you can't have sex unless you have the possibility of a child being born. So that would obviously go against homosexuality, against masturbation, against the use of contraception, because it's the idea that you're intervening with God's will, that sex is not about pleasure. It's okay, that's part of it, lovely, the church recognises that. I mean, they can't not, can they? But its primary purpose is reproduction, in keeping with Aquinas' natural law and the primary precepts. Of course, the utilitarian thinker would come marching in and say, hang on, you know, the greatest good for the greatest number, the greatest happiness, pleasure is important. Pleasure is essential. And so, if it brings you pleasure, Go for it. Brings you pleasure more than it's harming anyone. What's the harm in that? But then, of course, for these church teachings and the traditional teachings on marriage, no sex before marriage and having a monogamous relationship, the problem, the challenge is coming from secularism. There's a tide of secularism sweeping much of the Western world. Not so much America, but certainly Britain. France, secular. You know, there is a change in attitudes. So the authority of the church teachings, so the papal infallibility, the magisterium, the catechism, the Bible, and natural law, the authority is being diminished. And so this leads to a questioning of the church teachings, a questioning of the authority, and a need for justification. So how can you actually teach that? How can you actually say that? So this is why we're getting into sex ethics, trying to understand the reasons for the decisions and whether they are right, whether sex should just be about being in a marriage, be open to life, whether they're wrong, whether actually it serves another purpose, bringing people together, fulfilling their desires, pleasure, a biological impulse, urge and need. We've then got extramarital sex, which of course adultery is a big no. If we go to Leviticus in the Old Testament, the death penalty is given, stoning is given for the adulterer and the adulteress. In the same way that a man that lies with a man is told that it's an abomination, Leviticus is equally as forceful towards those who engage in adulterous behaviour. So adultery is seen as a very negative thing, obviously, in Christian history, in Christian teaching. However, of course, Jesus says, when it's a story in the New Testament when they're about to stone an adulterous woman, he comes along and he says, "He who is without sin may cast the first stone." And perhaps whilst not saying adultery is fine, go on, go for it, that ushered in a more compassionate approach. Now obviously that's not to say in the 2,000 years since Jesus, Christians have been compassionate to people who are adulterous or who engage in homosexual acts. But what it does say is that Jesus may represent a more compassionate approach. So those that use the Old Testament to justify their condemnation of things like adultery, actually, we are all sinners, says the New Testament. You know, the fall, everybody is fallen. All of humanity is in sin. And so should we really be judging, or should it be more about compassion? And linking that to homosexuality, Pope Francis, whilst again, and this is the interesting bit, without changing the church teaching, a compassionate attitude is introduced. He said on homosexuality, you know, if someone is gay and they seek God, who am I to judge? Ushering in a respect for all people without actually saying, okay, we don't condemn that action. The condemnation is still there, but there's also a compassion. Is that a hypocrisy? Or is that a positive step forward? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. So the issues of extramarital. So if you're in an open marriage, is extramarital activity fine? You know, if you're not hurting anybody, utilitarianism, because everybody in the marriage agrees, yeah, it's open, what is the harm in that? And if we take a look at the teachings from the Old Testament, there's actually examples of people with multiple wives. Polygamy has occurred throughout history, and that has not led to the destruction of the world. So actually, it's this new phenomenon, if you like, of strict monogamy, one person for life, and not all animals do that. Some animals do, but not all of the animal kingdom. Is that actually helpful? Is that what God would want? So there's some interesting ideas to start thinking about on premarital and extramarital sex, both condemned, of course, by the church, but with a little bit more compassion in there from Jesus and from modern teaching. So homosexuality is our next topic. So obviously homosexuality is the sexual orientation or attraction to a person of the same sex. So obviously 2 men, 2 women. And for a long time it was criminalised in the UK and across countries and cultures. It's interesting, if we go back to ancient Greece, there is evidence of same-sex sexual activity. So it's happened throughout human history, and at the time it wasn't necessarily as frowned upon. So at the time of Plato and Aristotle, there was not so much, this is horrific, this is terrible, this is so bad. And it was only in biblical teaching then that ushered in, with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, when God punishes the village because the men have engaged in homosexual acts, homosexual rape. So we could say, well, it's rape, that's why he's punishing them, not because of the homosexuality. It's with that teaching and the fact, and this is the key church point made, the fact that homosexuality is not open to life, so that sex act cannot produce a child, that it is seen as sinful by the church. And in Humanae Vitae, which was a key encyclical published by the church, by Pope Paul VI, I think, do check that though, he said all men are called back to the observation of the natural law, that it goes against natural law. Humanae Vitae, key quote here, key soundbite, says homosexuality is intrinsically disordered, that it goes against the natural order, the desire to reproduce. And we could say, well, hang on a minute, is it? If you have a natural desire, a natural urge or inclination, how can that be not natural? And the church itself in the catechism says that the number of people with homosexual tendencies is not negligible. So it admits and accepts that people have these impulses and desires, that it is a thing. However, the church then says it is a test, it is a challenge that these people need to overcome. So whilst they should be treated with sensitivity and compassion and respect, this is church teaching that I'm telling you now, so make sure you can quote this in the exam, catechism, church teaching, that they need to be helped to overcome those same-sex urges, that they're not good, that they're not natural, they're not normal. However, and this was a cultural thing as well, it's not to say Christianity alone condemned homosexuality. However, this was, a big thing in the UK and all countries. 1957 was a landmark moment when the Wolfenden Report was published, and it recommended that homosexual acts between consenting adults should no longer be illegal. Now, as part of this debate, really interesting comments were, as you can imagine, made. And Patrick Devlin made a very interesting point, because the whole idea was, if it's consenting adults, it's not harming anybody, why are we regulating what people do in their bedroom? Devlin said, and this links in brilliantly to natural law and the idea of ordering of society, that if homosexuality was not made illegal, so it did not stay illegal, it would undermine society, because we have a common morality and purpose to survive and reproduce. And Devlin says if you legalise homosexuality, that will be lost. And so it might not be causing harm, but as a collective morality, as a moral position, the UK needed to stand against homosexuality because of what it represented for reproduction, what it represented for the ordering of society. It would open the floodgates, if you like, to all sorts of inappropriate sexual practices which were not conducive to the production of life going forwards. So he was challenged by Herbert Hart, bless him, with a name like that, I love you. And Herbert Hart said that society should enforce only a minimal morality based on protection from harm. And this is a crucial link here to John Stuart Mill's liberty principle, that as long as you are not harming anyone else, you should be free to do what you want. And Stuart Mill's non-harm principle, so important, the idea of negative liberty, that unless you are going to cause harm, you should be absolutely free to do what you want. And of course we could respond here and say, well, homosexual people are harming themselves by engaging in this, by giving into these desires, so we need to help them. But John Stuart Mill, very clear, if something like homosexual sex is not hurting anybody else, then it cannot be the government's position to regulate. What goes on in your bedroom is your business. However, obviously, Patrick Devlin representing a position that the morality of the country was at stake if legalisation took place, because it would lead to a neglect of that common focus on reproduction and survival of the fittest of the species, and would open the floodgates to something that was seen as immoral. Now, obviously, church teaching, religious teaching, has not been the most positive. Leviticus, the man shall not have sex with a man as he does with a woman. It's punishable by death. And Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis, punished because of the homosexual acts. And there's also evidence from the New Testament. So Corinthians chapter 1 verse 6, and the idea there's opposition to homosexuality presented by St. Paul, that acts such as same-sex sexual relations are classified as an immoral thing, as a dangerous, so like sodomy is a bad thing for society if people are able to engage in it. So there's lots of issues for the religious ethics field when it comes to sex ethics. For example, gay Christians, if Christianity says, yes, you can be gay, but you can't act upon that, so is it saying celibacy? So are they actually saying it's the act or the inclination that is wrong? The adoption of children by gay couples, the ordination of gay clergy. So if someone was gay and wanted to be a priest, the classic church position at the moment is no, you cannot be a priest if you are gay. That's not acceptable. Can homosexuality be cured? The use of conversion therapy. You hear all sorts of stories of people sent off to like Bible boot camps where they are told to pray the gay away, and they're subjected to, very forceful sermons and treatment about overcoming their homosexuality. So if the church is saying it's wrong, should the church be actively treating people for their homosexuality? Is that the duty because you're helping them to not harm themselves? So lots of issues there. Let's then apply the ethical theories to this question. So natural law. Natural law, I will remind you, of course, of the fact of the primary precepts, which involve the preservation of life, reproduction, ordering of society, worship of children, worship of God, education of children. They are important. So if the telos and the purpose is to reproduce and to have an order in society, this would obviously condemn homosexuality. And the idea that you could have an extramarital affair because the order of society is lost. And if it's not open to having children, Aquinas' key writing on this is that if there is not the transmission of semen, if there is not the opportunity for a child to be born from it, then it is an immoral, illegitimate act. Marriage, of course, natural law stresses the importance of marriage in terms of the children, in terms of worshipping God through being a marital unit in the Christian community, and the need for order in society. Divine law, remember we have the eternal, the divine, the natural and the human. So if we're looking at the divine law and look at the teachings in the Bible, what we are finding here, Leviticus, Corinthians, Sodom and Gomorrah, is a godly condemnation of homosexuality, and again, of course, of premarital, extramarital sex. They are condemned in Scripture. For example, do not commit adultery is one of the 10 commandments. We're not trying to oversimplify matters, but that is quite a self-explanatory point there from the 10 commandments. And then obviously real and apparent goods. And this is all about sex and pleasure being a secondary purpose. That the focus is reproduction, but then you can have pleasure from it as well. So what is the focus and what is a byproduct that we can enjoy? Should the focus be pleasure or reproduction? Because that then obviously influences whether homosexuality is to be treated as moral or immoral. So how can we assess that application? So natural law is linked to God and belief in God. So if somebody is religious, then it would help them in their decisions on sex ethics. It's based on the idea that God controls the world, God is manifest in nature, and that it is his law, his will that ought to be done. Now it makes an assumption that the only purpose of sex is reproduction, and this is an assumption. It's saying that the tell-off is to bring this about. How do we know that? Is it pleasure? Obviously, because that's what naturally may happen if you have sex, plot twist, spoiler, it's not necessarily the only purpose. So why is the only tell-off to reproduce? Why can't it be to strengthen your relationship, to have love, to have pleasure? And what would a utilitarianism perspective be on that? Now, natural law is legalistic, of course. It's very fixed, it's dogmatic, it's rigid, and it's influenced that human vitality teaching that homosexuality is intrinsically disordered. It is quite set in its ways. And so actually, if we look at the changes in society, 1957 Wolfenden report, for example, that society has moved on, society has evolved. If you think about the social and scientific changes and progress, the contraceptive pill, condoms, new insights into homosexuality, that it is natural, there might be a gay gene, that it's a product of your nature and your nurture. All these advances, IVF, meaning that if you can't naturally reproduce, you can be helped with medical intervention, adoption, all these things that have happened. And so actually, is it outdated to still just think, right, sex, reproduction, that's it, done? Because there's so much more going on now. There's so many more enlightened attitudes and scientific ways. Gay people can reproduce, just not in that original sex act. So has natural law, in its legalistic approach, failed to keep pace with changes in modern society? So that is some perspectives that we can take on natural law. Let's now apply situation ethics. And of course, the key concept behind situation ethics, agape, the idea of love. And love decisions are made in the situation, not as a prescription. The only good thing is good. We will our neighbours good, whether we like them or not. It's all about agape and it being subjective to that situation. So the loving thing, obviously we're not talking, interestingly, about eros love here. We're talking about agape love, which is that more selfless Christian love associated with Jesus. But that love in itself, an unconditional love for your neighbour, would suggest condemning their homosexual desires or judging them for having an extramarital affair. That is not the loving thing to do. Jesus, he who is without sin may cast the first stone. The idea that the loving thing to do is to accept people, to not judge them, and to embrace them. Now, we can see a difference in sex. So if sex is in a loving relationship, great. But what if it's being used in a negative way, as a means to an end, for example? In that case, Fletcher's situation ethics may say, well, love is not the focus here. It's quite abusive. Maybe, they are using the person to fulfill their sexual desires and needs. And so actually, is situation ethics always going to approve of these kinds of sexual practices if love is not the focus, but love more important than the legalism and the biblical scripture and the church hierarchy and dogmatic teachings? So Fletcher is of course highly critical of those teachings in his approach. He criticised the legalistic, and he said we need to have a more autonomous morality. Now he was particularly critical of church teachings, of natural law teachings on homosexuality. He said that it is difficult to see how rejecting homosexuality could ever be the most loving thing to do, because it harms people, it hurts who people naturally are. And so how is that loving? How is that consistent with the Christian commitment to agape and love? So actually, the most loving thing is to accept and embrace people as long as they're not causing harm, linking maybe to the J.S. Mill's non-harm principle there. Extramarital sex, maybe a little bit more hard to justify with the loving thing. And of course, we've got to consider that it could be acceptable. Is it loving if you're having a bad time in your marriage? Is it the loving thing to go and spice things up and have a bit of fun with Jenny down the road? Who knows? you know, we've got to remember, for Fletcher, it's all about the situation and the individual. So in that context, we've got to consider, weigh up, is it loving? Not prescribe something and say, this is the rules. You know, the 4 working principles: personalism, positivism, pragmatism, relativism. It's all about the situation, your circumstances, and having love as the ruling norm. And key to that is the person-centered approach, considering the individual involved. And so when we're talking about homosexuality, you know, we have a lot of parents that say, well, I didn't support homosexuality, I thought it was wrong, but then my son, my daughter was gay, and that changes their perspective. We focus on the individual. So how can we assess the effectiveness of situation ethics in making decisions with regards to sex ethics? It's not always helpful for Christians, of course, because whilst love is important, there may be other motivations and other factors to consider. For example, the church teachings, the encyclicals, the Bible, scripture, for example. So actually, should we just focus on love? It is helpful, though, in drawing a distinction between casual and loveless sex, and sex within a loving relationship, as we said. So that would justify maybe homosexual acts in a loving relationship, but not if it was, I won't go into detail obviously, but some sort of rampant desire with a group of 24 men. You know, let's keep it real here. At least you'll remember the example, but don't write it in the exam. And it is all about people, and it's all about the situation, and perhaps that's the most practical and positive approach to sex ethics, because it's about that individual and their individual experience and their happiness as a being. And is it more helpful in extreme cases than in everyday cases? So we could say, okay, so natural law is right about the ordering of society, keeping things going as it is now. But then in extreme exceptional circumstances, is that when a theory such as situation ethics should come in to assist us, to intervene, to say, in this case, the most loving thing to do? So, we've taken a look at 2 of the theories. I want to take a break now, just to diverge a little, because we've got to ask, these are 2 religious theories. Do they still have a role to play in modern sexual ethics? So we can say, yeah, okay, religion is a positive force. So we can say it is, it stops the cheapening of sexual acts. It recognises the significance of sexual acts, for example, in a marriage. So it means we don't cheapen or undermine that, and so open the door to a whole variety of inappropriate sexual acts which use people as a means to an end. It recognises the sanctity of every life, the value of life, and so why things need to be done in the proper way, in a loving, in a thoughtful, measured way. It also supports the ordering of society, of course, and make sure everything's working as it should do. And actually, Christianity could be seen in its early days, and Islam in its early days, as furthering women's rights, as promoting people as opposed to limiting them. So the link between religion and culture here is very interesting. You know, we often see religion as the problem, but actually is it culture and society that's the problem? And so when Jesus came along and said, he who is without sin may cast the first stone, that kind of compassion, that radical Christian agape, is actually a positive presence in sexual ethics today. But as a negative presence, of course, we can say attitudes are outdated. John Stuart Mill believed that the traditional Christian notion of marriage was, remember, Paul's portrayal of the man as the head of the couple. That traditional view is subjugating women. It gives them a lesser role. And in Theology and Gender, that's a revision video you can see very soon. In that video, I talk about the fact that when we portray the Catholic image of marriage, the woman is seen as the homemaker, making a domestic haven, cooking the meals, looking after the children, oh look at my hair, and making sure that they are happy whilst the man is in charge and he's marching off to work. And so obviously the church says that the roles are different but equal, but John Stuart Mill says there's definitely a sexism and inequality that's going on here. We could say that natural law in particular as a religious approach is too narrow. It only sees the purpose of sex as reproduction. That's narrow and limited. It doesn't take into account the whole scope, the whole purpose and the whole situation. And obviously it's outdated because of contraception, because of new laws, new understandings, adoption, IVF, etc. And the French philosopher Michel Foucault, obviously it'd be said, Foucault or something like that, bless him. He argued that Christianity is guilty of controlling sexual practices. It is all about limiting people. Is that a good thing for the ordering of society? Patrick Devlin in the Wolfenden debate, you could say yes, but he said it's a bad thing. He said sexuality is a spectrum, and so Christianity is trying to put you in a box and say, this is what you should be, this is how it should be. Maybe an attempt toward a society, yes, so good intentions, but at the same time, what happens as a result is that we restrict people, and religion as a restrictive force means it shouldn't be involved. It's an unhelpful approach. It's a restrictive lens. So, we've taken a look at the religious perspectives on sex ethics. Oh, good Lord. Oh, amen. Now, what about the secular approaches? Okay, what about the utilitarian points of view and the Kantian ethics point of view? So, utilitarianism, Bentham, of course, Act, John Stuart Mill, our man, Rule, Peter Singer, preference. So, we've got this idea of pleasure, the greatest happiness for the greatest number as our measure of right and wrong. Secular theory, all about the democracy, about the majority ruling, and if it's leading to pleasure, it's good. If it's leading to pain, it's bad. What do we think? So obviously, pleasure as focus, that is something we all experience, we all desire, we all want. So surely that's a good basis for our ethical decision making, that pleasure is so important to us as individuals, and so that is right. However, we could say G.E. Moore, the naturalistic fallacy. Just because it's natural, just because it's pleasurable, doesn't mean it's right. And so pleasure could be wrong. And the example that is always used, and in past examiners' reports have said he's overused. So I don't know whether to say use it or not, because it works, but it is overused a lot. Bentham's Act Utilitarianism leads to the justification of gang rape, because at the end of the day, the greatest pleasure for the greatest number, the group of people are getting pleasure, although obviously an awful pleasure, out of committing a crime and raping somebody. And so that would be justified under Act Utilitarianism. Obviously, we could say Rule Utilitarianism, the higher and the lower pleasures, avoids this because it says, well, that is definitely a lower pleasure, that is absolutely horrific, that cannot be justified. But in its original form, simply a focus on the pleasure of the majority can lead to the tyranny of the majority, to things like gang rape. It could lead to unacceptable and harmful sexual practices, which actually would cause more harm than good, even if in the moment someone thought it was pleasurable. Tolerance. Now, Mill regards sexual pleasure as a lower pleasure, but his non-harm principle states that it's all about allowing people to do what they want as long as they're not harming anybody else. So as long as no one else is harmed, there should not be a rule against homosexuality because it's not harming anyone. And so the non-harm principle would suggest, the Wolfenden report is correct, we need to legalise homosexuality. It doesn't cause harm to anybody else. The government should only ever intervene if there is going to be harm caused. Now, we can also consider the issue of consent and preference. Peter Singer argues that the different preferences of people involved is what matters. So for the gang rape case study, for example, we could say, well, Peter Singer would say you need to consider the preferences of everybody. So obviously the victim would then have just as much credibility and a voice as the perpetrators because it's their preferences as well. So for example, If you're homophobic, is it any of your business about the gay couple next door? Is it really? No. However, if you're involved, so if you're the victim of an affair, does that change things? So is it about your involvement and how hurt you are by it, the non-harm principle? Okay, so that is fine. We can say homosexuality is fine, but then if a wife's husband goes off and has an affair with another man, that's causing them harm. And so the issues arising are that how involved are you? Are we taking everybody's perspectives into account? And is pleasure the only motive we should be using? And then obviously evidence. Utilitarianism is all about collecting that evidence of philosophic calculus, the use of understanding what is bringing out pleasure to make those decisions. And so whilst you could say natural law, for example, is just basing it on ancient teachings that sex should only be for reproduction, utilitarianism actually turns to the evidence and says, well, what is the harm being caused? Is the harm? No. Okay, then there's no evidence to say this should not be allowed. So assess it. Utilitarianism, it's progressive and modern. It's keeping up to date with the modern world. It's modern decision making in a nutshell. It takes sexual ethics as both private, the non-harm principle, it's up to you, it's your personal body, your personal life, the autonomy of the individual, but also as relative to the situation, to the circumstances. So it's not dogmatic and saying this is never right. It's taking into account the circumstances and the situation in which you find yourself. Now, does it focus too much on pleasure? One man's pleasure is another man's pain. Is it supporting gang rape? Now here's the thing. Here's a juicy bit of gossip. So Bentham did support homosexuality in the same way that John Stuart Mill did, but he also supported the act of an older man having a sexual relationship with a younger adolescent boy. So he thought that was acceptable as well. Don't know how that would go down in Parliament today. So, you know, are there lines that need to be drawn that utilitarianism fails to take into account? And of course it requires an assessment of the future. So it's looking at what the outcomes are going to be. Surely that's a positive thing. And then we've got Kantian ethics. Our man Kant. Deontology, duty. So, now he talked, of course, about the postulates of freedom, immortality and God. So we are free to do our duty. So on homosexuality, he disapproved of homosexuality. He said it lowers man below beasts. So I think we know quite clearly what his views on it were. And it is true, of course, that homosexuality cannot be universalised. So what Devlin was saying, the idea that if everybody was gay, then the order in a society, then the future of humanity would actually be undermined, because newsflash, if we were all gay, there would not be any children being produced. However, we've got to understand that we respect people as ends, not as a means to an end. So, and here's the great bit, criticising Kant's own position, if we are saying that we are only here to reproduce, that is surely using us as a means to an end. Surely if everybody is an end themselves, which is central to Kant's teaching, then we shouldn't just be saying, well, the purpose of life is to reproduce. No, the purpose of life is whatever you make it. It's about respecting you as an autonomous individual being. Now, Kant held a very high view of marriage. He saw it as an important contract that would ensure we keep our promises. Remember, he was very big on promises and duty. The shopkeeper was not doing good business to help people. It was all about your duty. So if lowering the prices would increase sales, no, it had to be as an end in itself, that he was doing the right thing because it was right, not to achieve some other motive. And of course, the idea of having contracts, duties, agreements, necessities that you have to do all the time. And of course, then if you broke a contract, so you broke your marriage vows, for example, he was not looking very favourably on that. And he also strongly opposed promise breaking. So then extramarital sex would be criticised, because if we universalised Remember the hypothetical categorical imperatives. If we universalise extramarital sex, marriage would become meaningless. The duty in it would be undermined. We'd have no order in society. So the idea that people are treated as an end, as a means, not as a means to an end, is a good thing because it's representing the autonomy and the individual's right as a human being. So that's a very positive thing. It presents a casual attitude to sex, having sex as a means to an end, using someone to get your kicks and run off, as it very much were. It's quite logical. It doesn't let feelings get involved. You could say that is a good thing because it means that we have to make the moral decision, the rational, right decision. You could also say, well, sex is about emotions and feelings and love and commitment and eros and agape. So you've got to include feelings because they're essential to human life. Kant's idea that man must be disciplined for by nature he's raw and wild, that is undermined here. Now, universalisation. Is it actually relevant when it comes to sex ethics? Okay, so no. You can't universalise homosexuality, but not everybody is gay. So why would you have to condemn one person being gay based on whether everybody was gay? They're very different situations and circumstances. So is it actually appropriate to apply the universalisation in the case of sex ethics? And therefore, is it appropriate to be applying Kant and duty and his views here to these issues? But obviously on marriage, the idea of duty and breaking rules, it sets a very clear standard, and that gives structure, a framework and certainty to our opinions and position on marriage. It draws upon that commitment and that duty, which is very, very important. So just one last little point. Is sexual behaviour private? And this is of course what we were saying about John Stuart Mill's non-harm principle. Whether it is a personal matter or whether it's a public matter. Devlin saying it's public because it's all about our collective morality, about the success of society, about our reproduction and the survival of our species, whereas Mill saying actually no, because you're not killing someone, you're not harming someone, you are doing something in the privacy of your own home that is about you and you alone. So that should empower the individual. As long as they're not harming anyone, the government should remove the regulations, remove the restrictions. Why are we regulating practices that are private at the end of the day? And I suppose you could link in Fletcher there. If it's loving, it's all about the individual in that situation. And so the removal of the rules, of the teaching that it's intrinsically disordered, that people need to be called back to the natural law, that homosexuals should be treated with compassion, but that the behaviour is unacceptable. There's no need for them. You can compare it to, okay, adultery hurts someone. You could say homosexuality is not. But then, again, natural law, ordering of society, the requirement to reproduce. So we have to ask, who makes the decisions? Is it a minimal morality, or are we regulating every decision and act people are engaged in? And then, how could modern issues, or issues that are currently in the public domain, affect this? So get thinking, revenge porn, domestic abuse, IVF, abortion, contraception, homosexuality, polygamy. This is a massive, massive topic, a really big and contentious issue. And as we've seen, all four of our normative ethical theories have something to say on it. 2 of them religious, 2 of them we are seeing as secular. And the idea of should we be regulating this issue in the first place? Surely we need some standards, some rules and some expectations, but at the same time we have to then say, well, hang on a minute, what about individual choice and free will and the autonomy of the individual? So we've had a lovely 50 minutes together talking sex ethics. Thank you so much for joining me. If there's anything else you'd like to know, anything you'd like to ask or add, then please do comment down below. Let me know what you're thinking. Follow me on Instagram, BenWardle_, Twitter @BenWardleUK. Thank you very much for your company. Have a good day. Bye bye.